Hello and welcome to today's episode of Courage Permission Slip. I am your host, Kia, and today I get to welcome a friend and a fellow coach, Mary Blalock, to the show. But before we get started, I want to tell you just a bit more about her. Mary is a career coach, public speaker, and self-proclaimed psychology and self-help nerd, I can relate, who helps women and non-binary folks advance in their careers by teaching them how to identify their strengths, define their career personality, and confidently tell their career story. Welcome to the show, Mary.
Hi, it's great to hang out with you.
I know in an official capacity, we've had so many of virtual coffees and in-person coffees, and it's fun that we get to do this on Courage Permission Slip.
I know, totally. I love your podcast.
Thank you so much. And so, talking about how I can relate to the self-help and psychology nerding out. But one thing that I don't think gets talked about enough that I would love for you to touch on a bit before we really dive into Courage Permission Slip, Mary, is why is it important from your perspective for someone to define their career personality?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. I think about this all the time because that's kind of how I start with, that's like the entry point into my coaching is figuring out someone's career personality, because I help people a lot with their career direction. And it's an interesting topic for me because I actually feel like a lot of the personality tests and things that are out there are not effective. And there's actually some, if you want to get real deep and nerdy, you and I haven't got nerdy on this topic, which I think we should, is about like inherent bias in some of those testing things, which there's been research on some of them being not good for the people, it's stereotypes and things like that. And I see that a lot when I'm doing research on career direction and personality and how you connect those two. There's a lot of, oh, you're a woman, you're a people person, you should go into, people-oriented careers. You're a man, you're probably into, it's not that blatant, but there traditionally has been a lot of stereotyping when it comes to career personality or personality tests. What I like to do is work with clients on what they believe. So tapping into their intuition about who they know they are. Because I think we've all had the experience where you've taken a personality quiz and you're like, not really. Kind of, but that's not me. Or something bothers you about the description. And that's because they're not perfect. It's like an algorithm. And I love that moment because that's when you're really saying, no, this is wrong. And I know what's right. And that's what I try to tap into with my clients is their own intuition and self-knowledge. And rather than labeling them, figuring out the dynamic and nuanced personality that they bring to their career. And it could be a combination of some things that don't seem to make sense, but they do to that person.
I love, because, this is one thing that I talk about a lot is trusting your own voice, listening to and trusting your own voice. And I really appreciate that you bring that into an evaluation or a moment where you're working with someone to define their career personality, because that is so right. And obviously the whole personality quizzes, that's really broadening because, Enneagram is being brought in and astrology is being brought in and, all sorts of other modalities are being brought in really to remind us all that we don't fit perfectly into any one box, right? No one group of people, no one set of personalities is a monolith, right? We all have these little pieces of our personality that can tilt the scales one way or another, depending on who you are as a person, and then all the other like cultural aspects that come into into who we are, what we enjoy, what we don't enjoy, what we want to do. So I really, really appreciate that you bring that perspective to people, and really giving them permission to say, okay, this is how I identify as a personality, as a gender preference, whatever it is, right? But here are all the other things that make me me. Now what do I do with that? So it's really wonderful that people have someone like you to help them navigate that.
Yeah. And that's why I love talking to you, because we totally geek out on the same things. And your perspective in terms of tapping into your own courage is like exactly that same idea or message around really going deep into that internal motivation or that passion or drive that you might not have when you're worried about the future, but tapping into that and figuring out where it is can feel kind of like you're going deep into the unknown for a bit.
Yes. And that can be scary for people.
It can
really
be
scary.
It's so obvious for me as a coach from the outside to sometimes see a lot of times what people are trying to say. And people will oftentimes say to me, I'm just babbling, I'm not making sense. And I'm like, no, you're making so much sense.
Yes.
So it's like that. That's what I love, is when people, they have that knowledge, but they might not be seeing what's right in front of their face.
Right. Yeah. And that, I mean, really, that is the beauty of working with a coach, because we have the listening skills, we have the training, and then we have the lived experience, right, of being able to help people decipher what feels like, gobbledygook to them. To us, it's like, oh no, here's what I heard. And then people are like, yes, that's exactly what I was trying to say. That's exactly what I meant. So, helping people have those aha moments really is, it's a joy like none other.
Yeah. Yes, that feeling.
Especially for us self-help nerds.
Totally. Yeah.
So Mary, you started talking about this, so we're just going to go right in. This show is all about giving people courage permission slips. So for you, I would love to hear your perspective on what does the word courage mean to you or for you?
Yeah, I mean, this because you're an expert in it, but I think it's confusing to a lot of people what courage is, and it was to me back before I started really diving into this stuff, is courage. I mean, I always think about CNN Heroes, which is that show where it, puts people on stage and gives them awards for doing really big things, like figuring out how to turn dirt into water through engineering and stuff like that. And I remember I used to be really intimidated by those shows, because I was like, I want to do big things and help the world. But that feels really intimidating to think about. That's what courage looks like. And for me, I actually have realized through studying and through coaching and working on myself too, is that courage is actually about taking smaller steps. And I know you've talked about this too on your podcast. And when we talk, is that it actually takes more courage to figure out how to get started, or figure out how to be consistent and do the same thing over and over for a longer period of time, rather than it can feel so overwhelming to think about, changing the world, solving climate change, solving racism, all these things that are so important, but so big. And I think people just tend to get stuck when they think about the big picture, and they think that's what courage is. And so then they do nothing. So people come to me a lot, and I'm sure you've heard this from your clients in the past too, is I want to do all this stuff. I'm really excited about it, but I can't even do one thing now. Right. And so what I really encourage people to do is to find a strategy, find a focus, and then stick to that over time consistently and build on that so that because that's what those, CNN heroes or like any big, iconic person throughout history didn't do it in one day.
Right. And also, with regard to these CNN heroes, or you think of anyone who throughout history who has done these big things, they more than likely never, when they started working on what they were working on, they didn't set out to say, I want to change the world with this, right? They start small and it ends up being this big thing. But that's not their intention when they started. It's, oh, I want to make a difference in my community. Oh, I want to make it so that it's not hard for people to vote, right? Or I want to make it hard. I want to make it so that it's not hard for people to get access to resources, right? But then to your point, and I'm so glad that you said this, with that vision and the decision to move forward, the courageous decision to move forward, but then also the consistency. And it's having that like stick-to-itiveness, that is really what is the difference maker. That's the change maker, because I think in the age of the 24-hour news cycle, the age of Instagram and Twitter, it feels like people are like overnight successes, right? It feels like, oh, they just made this decision, and then all of a sudden, all these people's lives are being changed, or their lives are being changed, or now all of a sudden they're, millionaires. And that's not, it looks like that, but that's not how it happened. And it certainly isn't typically. Now, maybe in some cases it is, but I think in most cases, people don't start out with that vision of, oh, I want to be known all over the world for XYZ. They start out just wanting to make something. Also, sometimes people just start out wanting to do something for themselves, right? Like, oh, I didn't have access to, baby clothes, right? And then like all of a sudden, major websites are being built and apps, and then, then you're being featured on, the morning news show, and then everyone wants to use it. So it really is making that first decision and then taking those steps, the little steps consistently. I'm so glad that you pointed that out.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, exactly. Everything you're saying is so true. And I feel like we're having just our regular conversation too, because it's so true even for us, right?
Yeah.
In fact, before we got on here, we were talking about our own goals for the year and how that is something we have to keep reminding ourselves to be consistent, to keep building on what we've already done, to make it like we're building a structure rather than like finishing it all the time. Because like we were saying before, it doesn't make sense to think you're going to finish and be perfect this year. And that perfectionist mentality is thinking like, oh, I have to get it right this time around. And you might not get it perfect, but you'll get it, it'll be better over time.
Right. And I think, and really the part of this, which what I'm hearing you saying is progress, right? Progress. I think this is a hashtag. I probably have used this hashtag, progress over perfection, right? Because perfection is not possible, right? But somewhere along the way, this nugget has gotten into our brains, a la, yours truly, a recovering perfectionist. It's just not possible, but it's like, but are you moving the ball forward? Are you further down the road today than you were last week or last year or even 2 years ago? That's what counts. That's what counts. And I think it's so easy to forget that, just in the, in the type of world that we live in.
Yeah, definitely. And I use this metaphor all the time in my coaching where, when you go into Google Maps to map your direction somewhere, you start out with your location. And so I think about starting out with what your strengths are and what you bring to your career first. Like, where are you now? And then mapping out the future, like, where do you want to go? But I always start with where are you now? Because it's so important to think about what all your years of being a person in this world, there's something that you're not going to switch into a totally new person. And that old person suddenly, not going to transform into this like totally different person. And if you want things to change. And so it is building on who you are now and then who you want to be in the future, and building on that, like you were saying, as like a structure or a like foundation. I forgot what you just said, but the foundation, and building on that, just like you would plan a trip. You're like, where am I going? Where do I want to go? And then how do I get there is like the directions in between, turn right, turn left, all those steps along the way to get you. You can't just have an out of body experience and I couldn't just say, I'm here right now, I'm going to visit Kia and magically be there. I have to probably have traffic or get lunch along the way. So
yes, there's still multiple steps along the way that you have to take. But so great segue, by the way, Mary. So in talking about where you are now and the steps you've taken to get there, how did giving yourself permission to be courageous lead you to where you are or what you're doing right now?
Yeah. Well, I grew up pretty scrappy, so I think that helps. I changed schools a lot when I was younger. And so I was always in a cafeteria with people I didn't know, and like, okay, now I have to make new friends. So I definitely think there are some things there that helped me kind of like just with my personality and like doing something new. There's always that. I also want to mention the privileges. Like, I have, as a white woman, I have a lot of privileges too in like navigating things. And so that is definitely a part of the process that I like to like just acknowledge and bring up as part of, what can give someone courage, right, in this society. But when you and I talk about like what's motivating us day to day, it's all about really practicing what we preach to our clients too. And that's what's fun about talking to you, is we have similar struggles with the challenges that we give our clients and then seeing them in our own lives. And I think part of being in integrity with what your purpose is in life and what your career direction is that you're not faking it. You're learning because you're growing. And I'm helping my clients along a path, and I'm growing along a path at the same time. So I'm kind of learning the same things. Like we talked about perfectionism or consistency. It's not like we've figured it out, right? We're coaches or speakers, and we have it all figured out. Like done.
And and so I'm so glad that you said that, Mary. And I know we've talked about this. And what you said is 1000% true. And still, there are moments where after I, have been on a call with a client, or I'm like going through an exercise, or I've just run into a hurdle, right? I've just hit a wall, and I do find myself beating up on myself every now and again, being like, why don't I have this figured out? Like, I coach people on this, I speak about this, like, what is my problem? And it is so, and I mean, the number of times I've said this on the show, I should get like I don't know, I should get like a compensated every time I say this, because we're human beings, right? And just because we're coaches doesn't mean we have it all figured out, right? Like, this is why therapists have therapists. This is why, this is just the fact of the matter, that none of us have it figured out. None of us do. And if any one of us did, we'd all be millionaires. We'd all be millionaires. None of us would have any issues. We wouldn't have anything to talk about.
Mhm.
because we're all on this journey together, right? And the only time that the journey is over is when you have transitioned out of this world. And
Mhm.
I remember one of my, when I first started my coaching business, and the coach that I had at the time, she so sagely said to me, we end up coaching people that are dealing with the same things that we are.
Mhm.
Right. And that is so true. That is so true. And often I will tell my clients, I mean, almost always, not just often, almost always, I will tell my clients, like, I'm on this journey with you. Like, the things that we're talking about, I either have been there, or I'm still struggling with these things, or it's something that, that I am, coming out on the other side of, but fairly recently. So, but that's what makes us good coaches, is that we are able to relate, we are human beings, and we're able to meet our clients where they are. Because sometimes, and I would love to hear if you experience this, sometimes clients and coaches too, there can be a power dynamic, right? Because you're the expert, right?
Right.
And so sometimes clients in particular will make themselves small, because they're like, well, you have it figured out, just tell me what to do. And it's like, nope, I
Mhm.
can't do that. I can't do that, because what is right for me won't necessarily be right for you. Like, my circumstances are completely different than yours. What I'm trying to achieve is completely different from what you're trying to achieve. But there is this kind of assumed power dynamic. And I'm not putting it all on the clients. Sometimes there are coaches that take advantage of that power dynamic too, right? So it's really important, I think, to let people know that they're not alone, that you're on the journey together, and and that there is a way out, right? Like, there is another side to it. But
Mhm.
just remembering that people aren't alone, and that they're not less than because they haven't figured it out.
Yeah. And that's another overwhelmed thing that can keep you
Mhm.
stuck, is because you're like, well, I mean, honestly, I didn't become a coach for a while because, are you okay? I didn't become a coach for a while because I was like, I don't have it figured out. And there got to be a point where I was like, okay, I think I need to start this coaching thing because I'm not going to have it all figured out. I do, however, I mean, I think you and I have specialized in an area that we have a lot of knowledge in. And so it's kind of what I encourage my clients to do, is like to get really get focused on what your strengths are, and get focused on learning a topic that's really interesting to you, or growing in a certain area that's interesting to you, because you'll get better at it over time. As I was thinking over courage and things like this for this podcast, I was thinking about how you do actually get more courageous over time when you repeat the same thing over and
Yes.
over. Like, you've been doing this podcast for a while, I'm sure you're not like, in the beginning you get nervous, or you get it's harder to do things, and then after a while you're like, oh, just showing up in front of lots of people and speaking engagements and stuff, it gets easier if that's your strength and your interest in the path that you're on. So my clients who are interested in public speaking, they get better at it. The ones who don't want to be public speakers, don't do it. It's
Right.
focus on what your path is. And so I think that's part of it too, is that there are some things. I always go back to this idea of learning and growth in your career, because a lot of my clients, just like we were talking about before, are coming to me for the answers, or for, people are like, I'm turning 30. I want to make sure that I have my life figured out. I'm turning 40. I'm turning 20. It's like, there's always this worry of that time and that you have to have it all figured out. And it's like, the secret is that you will still be figuring it out. I'm not 99, but
Yeah.
I'm sure at 99, there are still things you're learning and growing. And that's actually the beauty of life, And the beauty of your career is that learning and growth is exciting, but you want to be on a path that's interesting to you. Like if you're in a career path that isn't a good fit for you, then your boss might be like, what are your goals for the year? And you're like, ugh, I don't want any goals for the year because this sucks. Whereas you want to get in an area, a career path that's a focus that is exciting for you to grow in. And since you and I are both on our coaching and, your podcast and speaking path, then over time we've developed more courage and more momentum and more knowledge. Of self-help things that we've read all the books on.
Yes. And that is also like an ever evolving journey. So speaking of our courage and how we're evolving and how we're, trying things and working these muscles, but there are fears that we have to balance with that courage. And so I'm interested to hear from you, Mary, what fears pop up for you now?
I think the fear that is similar to what you were talking about, what we were talking about, is doing new things along the same path. It's still always uncomfortable for me to be like, I'm doing the same thing, like to keep that consistency of the same thing at the same time, trying new things. It's a weird balance. And also, I guess I would just want to say I have a lot of fears. I mean, it's weird I come across, I think in my classes or when I'm coaching, as really grounded or, just feeling like I have that solid grounding. And it's true, I do have that solid foundation in what I do. And I have a lot of like knowledge or advice to give and things like that. But anytime there's something new, I go into, fear mode. And like, I was even laughing because right before I jumped on here, I started getting, and I even kind of have it like a little nervous feeling and a little shaky. And I'm like, this is hilarious because I know you. I'm not worried about what we're going to say. And I'm excited about it. It's something I want to do. But for some reason, my body is like, we're going to shake a little bit more than we were before. So I think it's important, like you said, for people to know that even if you're like, new things are always going to be nerve-wracking or cause some kind of anxiety or, it might be even excitement, right? That you think is fear. And that's one distinguishing thing that I give to my clients is it's really important, especially in the job search, to notice red flags and to stay away from toxic environments that could be damaging to you. So it's important to always think about, am I afraid or am I excited? Because you want to pay attention to danger warnings in we talked about that courage inside and that internal knowing. And if you have a gut feeling something's wrong, or if you're in an interview and someone says something to you that's off in some way, that's like, I feel like this might be toxic, then that's a fear you want to stay away from. But fear of excitement, being excited to be with you on this podcast and share things, or going into an interview where you're excited about the job, that's a good fear. So paying attention to which one it is can help you get in touch with your intuition a lot better too.
So since we're talking a lot about the career element of this, right? And the coaching that you provide, and how many job seekers are running up against fears. And one thing that I hear a lot, so now I'm going to ask you to do a little coaching. One thing I hear a lot from job seekers, or just people who are just thinking, right? Like they're not even like fully in the market yet. They're just thinking about making that career shift. But one thing that I hear a lot is the fear of rejection.
Mhm.
What happens when someone says no or doesn't respond to me, right? And it's purely in a networking capacity or a relationship building capacity. What is your guidance for that person that is afraid, so deathly afraid of that reaction or non-reaction?
Yeah, and it happens. I mean, we like to think that we're immune from like, we will like to think that we don't have that. Yeah, we're not affected by those kind of situations, but it can really hurt you,
Yes.
especially in the beginning, because I think we're talking about doing new things. So the job search
Mhm.
is not something you do all the time. It
Mhm.
very rarely is someone job searching so long and so often throughout their career that they get good at it. So it's always kind of a new thing. And rejection, that first rejection with my clients is usually, I mean, it has to happen. It's very rare that my clients apply to one job and then get it instantly.
Mhm.
And so but when I'm coaching someone or when I'm in classes and that happens with people, they act like, oh no, this is terrible. And it's like the world comes crashing down
Mhm.
sometimes.
Mhm.
And I have sympathy for that completely in terms of your emotions, but
Mhm.
you need to go through that a lot
Mhm.
of times before you get to the one where you end up getting the job. And so I think that's the hardest part for me with
Yeah.
helping job seekers is that feels like a real kick to
Yeah.
be they get kicked down through that rejection and then it's harder to get up. But
Mhm.
once they get up and the rejection happens again, I actually had someone in my class one time have a really good idea that I tried implementing, but I think there's a better way to do it. She said, giving yourself a gold star for every time you get rejected from a job.
Mm.
And so saying it as a positive thing and saying, oh, I'm going to try to get 10 gold stars or 25 gold stars because I have to get rejected that many times. I've tried telling people that before, and I think just that word rejection is so hard
Mm.
for people to hear sometimes. So initially, I think it cannot be motivated, and people, have to take that first step,
Yeah.
and then after a while, realize that it's something that has to happen. It's kind of like, when you're first riding a bike as a kid, you're not really thinking, oh, I'm going to fall down a bunch. That's why I'm doing
Right.
this. So you
Right.
kind of have to think it's going to be fun or think it's going to work
Mhm.
out in
Mhm.
order to get that first leap of faith. And the reality is you're going to fall down a bunch of times, but you're going to get back up. And that's obviously a way that builds courage too, is knowing that that's going to happen and doing it anyway. And once there's momentum that happens in the job search, so the more that you put yourself into apply for jobs or do informational interviews, the more that you are taking those steps forward, and it starts to not feel as intense after a while.
Well, and so really quickly, Mary, going back to finding a different word for rejection, and actually two things I wanted to say about that, about the gold star, because
Mhm.
first of all, I think that's a great idea. First reason I think it's a great idea, and any like therapists that are listening, psychologists, this is, I mean, this well, but it's exposure therapy, right? Like the more that you expose yourself to the fear, the more you expose yourself to that thing that you're so deathly afraid of, the more you're able to take the power away from it. So with regard to the rejection piece, and I can't remember who said this. I mean, I know millions of people have said it by this point, but instead of looking at something as rejection, it's redirection, right? Because you're not going to keep giving yourself or giving energy to something that is really just, blocking you, right? Like you're not going to keep going after that thing that someone has said no, or they're not responding, right? Like you'll go back a couple times, right? I usually tell my clients, like, give it like 3 times, right? Of sending out the message, not hearing back, following up again. If you don't hear back, follow up one more time. And by that point, you've given it the college try, and you probably have your answer. But looking at it as a redirection to pointing you, it's data that's pointing you to something that is meant for you, or to someone who will honor you, or an organization or a company or an opportunity, whatever it is, right? That will honor you and who you are and all you bring to the table. I remember one of my guests, now he was in particular talking about a business idea that he had, but it was Micah Fields, and his thought that he had to himself was, oh, I'm going to show you. Right. So it's like having that, having that little edge that just kind of like keeps you moving forward. Right. It's built up that resistance and built up that resilience. Right. What was the other thing I was going to say? I lost my train of thought because I got to
no, it's great.
But I mean, the redirection piece, I think is really helpful for people to just as a reframe for that thing.
And I also think that it's good practice for everything. It's funny because sometimes I have clients who aren't really ready to job search right away, but I find that a lot of good stuff happens in building their resume, because you have to figure out how to articulate your skills. And then writing a cover letter, you have to kind of tell a story about it. So a lot of times people are like, oh, I hate writing a resume or a cover letter, especially the cover letter. But the cover letter tells a story. And what I've found, especially in my one-on-one coaching, is that if I build someone's resume and then we build the cover letter, by the time we get to the interview, they've already practiced a lot of the interview questions, because in order to build that stuff, I had to ask them questions. I'm like, I'm not clear on your resume. It doesn't explain how you did this thing that you want to do. And they're like, oh yeah, I had a project where I did that. I'm like, that's not in your resume. And then when I go to practice interviewing with them, I'm like, remember when you told me that story? Let's practice you talking about that during an interview. So I don't think people always realize that these tiny little steps are actually building that. So even the rejection, like if you went to an interview and you had even 3 interviews with a company, even if they, hire someone else, you got that practice that you're going to be so much better at that next interview. And so each tiny, it goes back to what we were saying before about each tiny little step building on itself. And I understand the anxiety and the just a lot of emotions that come up in the job search. And that feeling of rejection is real. But I watch my clients going through it, even if it doesn't feel great, and then they get the job and it's over. I mean, it's not over forever, but for that moment.
For that moment. Right.
You get to celebrate and just relax. You don't have to do it anymore. So you just have to spend that period of your time making it to that finish line. And
Mary, the other thing that I thought of in terms of talking about rejection, so we talked about the exposure therapy, but also it's so important to remember that a rejection or redirection, as we're working on reframing here, is not a referendum on your self-worth, right? You not getting the yes, or not hearing back on that LinkedIn request that you sent out, or not hearing back on a pitch that maybe you sent to someone. That is not a reflection of your levels of self-worth. I can't talk today. It's not a statement on you and your worthiness, and that sense of self really, it's important to build that up from the inside. And what you've been talking about today of like building that muscle, keep coming back, right? Like keep trying, not letting a no or a non-response or not getting a job offer or not doing well, performing well in a particular interview. That's not who you are as a whole person, right? Like we all make mistakes, we all stumble, but it's what you do with that information that can move forward in building up more self-worth for yourself.
Totally.
But it's so important for the person that's listening to this to remember that a redirect or a rejection is not a statement on your worth and who you are and your abilities that have brought you to where you are and doing what you are doing right now.
I agree with that 100%. And it's so important. And I also think that it's important to realize that you don't actually have to feel courageous when you're doing something courageous. Mm-hmm. I can't say that enough. It's like, because I have a lot of clients that are in toxic work environments. That's why they're job searching, mm-hmm. or they just are in a transition in their life. And I was saying this last night, and also with just thinking about, because I hear so many stories of people having that challenge. Like people say to me all the time, and I'm sure you've heard this too, that self-worth piece where it's like, mm-hmm. I feel horrible right now. Mm-hmm. My boss is treating me mm-hmm. not great, and it's really chipping away at my self-esteem, or I apply for jobs and I don't get them. And so I'm just feeling bad about myself, mm-hmm. and realizing that you actually don't have to feel good in order to do a successful interview, in order to get a job. That sometimes, just like I was saying, I was a little shaky coming in here. Like sometimes you go into something and you're not feeling like this rock star, but things go well anyway. And right. I think that's the misconception about this courage stuff is people wait until they feel courageous, mm-hmm. or they wait until they feel confident. They're like, someday I'm going to feel confident and I'm going to have this amazing career, mm-hmm. but I'm not going to do anything until I feel confident. And it's like, that just keeps you stuck. You get so stuck when you do that, because you actually might have to have a bad day at work, mm-hmm. Go to that interview, maybe during the workday. I know my clients have done it. I've done that, where you show up and you don't feel good, but you answer those questions and you talk about the things and especially if you have a coach and you can practice, mm-hmm. that definitely helps, because that practice gets better.
That's right.
But it is so important to realize that you don't have to wait until, mm-hmm. You're going to feel great when you get the job, and mm-hmm. you're going to have mm-hmm. that confidence, mm-hmm. but the courage piece isn't this amazing feeling. Sometimes it's a really bad feeling. Hate to say it, but sometimes you feel bad when you're courageous. You're doing something hard and it feels, and it's okay to let it feel hard and then celebrate later.
Yeah. Usually, courage, resilience, you feel good on the other side of doing it, just as you said, right? Like it doesn't feel like resilience itself does not feel good. But when you get to the other side of that thing that you are like, kind of like pumping up your skin to get through, that doesn't feel great. But on the other side of it, you're like, oh, wow, like I was really brave in that moment. I did not feel it, mm-hmm. but I knew that this thing that I wanted to do was more important than the fear that I was experiencing in that moment.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that because it keeps people stuck if they don't do that. And then I come to people come to me sometimes when they've been stuck for a long time, and they're just, because the longer you stay stuck, it just gets harder to take that first step. So it becomes part of your personality. So not letting that stuck feeling become a part of your personality, where you're starting to identify with, oh, I'm the person who's been stuck. get going now so that
Yeah.
you can take on that new courageous personality.
Exactly.
Start seeing yourself as someone who breaks that stuckness.
Yeah.
Like have that be how you see yourself.
Mm-hmm. So Mary, how have you embraced your stuckness to move past some of the fears that you have?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over, but maybe that's a good thing. I always tell my clients, when you say the same thing over, you have a consistent story you're telling. But I mean, it's funny. I just thought of this. I used to have a really hard time with perfectionism, and I know we've related on that before. I remember one time when I bought an IKEA desk, and it was pretty complicated to put together, but I didn't know that. I bought the desk and I was like, I'm going to set it up, and I'm going to set up this office space, and I'm going to feel productive and clear, and everything's going to go well for me. And like IKEA stuff happens, it was like midnight and I was halfway there. And I remember crying because I put so much pressure on myself that that desk was going to change my life. And then everything was going to be organized, and I was going to feel successful when I sat at that desk. And because it was so complicated, I really had to do it in a 2-day project. And I think that was the turning point for me when I was like, okay, I'm not going to do this to myself again, because I'm expecting this amazing transformation and I'm ending up in a ball of tears on the floor. Like something's wrong here, especially when I had been learning that for a while with therapy and stuff like that. And so I think I always go back to that moment when I think about projects, because I'm like, if I take on something big and courageous for myself, I really have to break it down. Otherwise, because it always takes longer than you expect. It's always, there's always something that you don't know that you have to learn. And for us recovering perfectionists, that can be really hard, because you're like, I want it done. I want to feel the gratification of completion, and but yeah, and asking for help and getting support from other people, not going at it alone. And so breaking it down, getting like slowing down, taking care of yourself. I think that's something I have to, I was going to say it's survival, but it's the only way to make things work. Things don't work otherwise. And I know you know that, because you've done big things in your life, and we've talked about our own goals and helped each other break them down, kind of talk through that process. So it's so important. Otherwise nothing happens. I mean, you and I don't get together and say, we want to do these big things, but we are not doing them. We're actually doing stuff.
Right.
And it can be frustrating to have it take longer, or, to not have that instant gratification. But when you look back, like we were saying about the interview, when people get the job and they look back and they're like, well, I didn't feel good, but I did it anyway. And now I have the job.
So one thing that you shared, Mary, that I think is something that doesn't get talked about enough, and it's this whole notion of expectations versus what's a word I could use, versus like preferences or hopes, right? Like when we lock ourselves so tight into an expectation of how something is going to go or how we think it should go, that is a recipe for disaster. Just as you said, and as you were talking, I was kind of snickering to myself, because this is literally something that happened to me before you and I got on, probably like 2 hours before we got on. And I was livid, right? I mean, like I was like slamming stuff down, because I so wanted to just like close the loop on something, right? I wanted to just do it and be done with it and move on to the other like 50 things on my list of things that I'm trying to get done this week, right? And when this one particular thing, something completely innocuous, completely, right? I mean, like, and I'm not even going to say it because people just be like, okay, Kia is a nutcase. So I'm not even going to say it, but it was something so simple and minuscule that in the grand scheme of things is completely figure outable. I'm just waiting for someone to give me information. But the fact that I couldn't just do it right then and there, it sent me, right? I mean, I completely went down a rabbit hole because I was so locked into the expectation. And then I got something that didn't meet my expectation. And that was painful, right? And so I think this is a muscle that's important for people to learn how to work, and that is not having expectations, or just not having expectations, but lowering your expectations, going into it saying, well, my preference is that it goes like this, right? So in your case of the IKEA furniture, my preference is that I will get this done and I can set it up tonight and use it and be on my way. Everything's going to be great. That's your hope, right? But know that, but there's a chance that this could go sideways in a hurry. And it's going to take me 2 days, or I'm going to have to hire someone to help me. Which, by the way, the last time I bought IKEA furniture, I hired someone. I was like, I'm not doing this.
That's really fun.
I'm not doing this to myself. But I think that's really an important takeaway is think about all the times that you've locked yourself into an expectation of how something was going to go or how you thought it was supposed to go. And when that wasn't met, which usually they are not, when that wasn't met, think about how much stress and strife and angst and anger and frustration that caused, right? And so that's our cue. You know, you talked about paying attention to, like, when you get a feeling about something, when you get an intuitive hit about something, pay attention to that, because that emotion is a signal of, oh, okay, maybe I should consider this the next time, or maybe I should, move off the path a little bit and start treading down this different path or this slightly new path, because I think I'm setting myself up for a bruising if I'm so locked into this way that I'm expecting something to go. Would you agree with that?
100%. And it's like, that's why I think that's the difference between, that's why we can coach too. I'm having this thought around, like, what is the difference with a coach? A coach is living the fact that this reality is happening day to day, where, whether it's IKEA furniture or a project of some kind or a job search interview, those are things that are happening. You and I know that it's going to go a certain way and that we're probably going to have that expectation versus what really happens, thing happening. We're like, here we go again. And we get to laugh about it with each other, maybe not laugh about it on our own, because we might, like you said.
Yeah, I was not laughing 2 hours ago. I was not laughing 2 hours ago. Ask my husband.
Yeah, but when you get to connect with other people who are in it, who understand, that's the difference with the entrepreneurs. That I always tell my clients, if you want to start your own business, you're going to be doing this all the time. Every day is going to be like a new software challenge or a new, it growth constantly, fear constantly. I'm doing new things all the time. It's not so much when you work for someone else, you're not put into the intensity like that all the time. But that's, I think, why it's fun to connect with other people who are doing things on their own when you're like, here we go again, because you're going to have a rockier road to go on when you venture out on your own. But it does help to have that connection with other people. I always think back to community care versus just self-care. And that's one thing that I encourage my clients to do too, is like connect with other people that, for some reason we think that with technology, everything needs to be so robotic and so isolated. And especially with the pandemic, a lot of people are a lot more isolated than before. And connecting with other people can help you have someone to laugh about it with, or, just remember that you're not alone. I think it's so many of my clients, and I think we all do this, is thinking, oh, everyone else has it figured out.
Yes.
And I'm the only one who's like crying because I couldn't figure out a software, or like your experience 2 hours ago, you can think like, oh, I'm so emotional, or I'm so like, I can't figure things out. I'm not being successful. You just can get down on yourself. But then when you hear someone else does it, when you hear Kia, who talks about this stuff all the time and is this great podcast speaker, has that same thing, you're like, oh, wait, it's okay if I do it, because this is like a human experience. So that's another piece that I like to remind people about with coaching, is connecting in with other people, not doing the job search alone, because it can be so isolating. And then you get caught up in your head thinking, what's wrong with me? Instead of realizing, oh, there are other people who don't like their job, don't feel confident, want to change their career. This is a normal human experience. It's not that there's something wrong with me.
Exactly. Oh, such good insights, Mary. So, as you know, I like to close with a guest's sage guidance for the person that is listening to this right now. You've shared so many tips already, but for the person that's listening to this right now and needs to have a bottom line for overcoming the fear that they have to taking steps toward their goal or their dream or their vision or their idea that they have brewing, what is your guidance to that person so that they can move forward?
It definitely goes back to take a step now that is a small step. It's going to be so much easier to think of what is something I can do this week that is going to, it doesn't even have to move you forward. It's just something that is on that trajectory. Like I always think about, find your resume. Like if you want to apply for a job and you haven't for a long time, do you know where your resume is? Just find it on your hard drive or wherever it is. So that could be a goal, is just finding it or opening it. Can be the first step. And that can, if you do that in one day and realize that you're going to do the next step the next day, I kind of look back on my life and the times when I don't have regrets. I don't believe in having a lot of regrets, but the times when I wasn't moving forward was when I was waiting for something to happen rather than just taking one little step. And so even if it seems like you're not going to make a difference in your life by finding that resume, it's definitely not going to get you a job right away. It's going to get you to that next step, And so doing something today, when you're listening to this podcast, taking one step is going to get you on that path. And you're going to look back to that one day when you took that first step and be like, I'm so glad I did that one thing. Because if I didn't do it, if you don't find your resume for a month, you're not starting until that month. So,
and I love that you said, Mary, that sometimes the step isn't even an actual step, right? It's not like applying for a job. It's not reaching out to someone. It is simply finding the piece of paper that has all of your like credentials and accomplishments on it. Just find it. Right? Because then that's one less question that you have to answer for yourself. Of where is it? What file, what, zip drive did I save it in? Or what folder is it on my computer? So I like that you broke it down even to that of just finding the piece of information that you need in order to take the next step. And it's a bridge to that next step, which is just kind of like the waterfall to all the next steps. So love that, Mary. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I so appreciated everything that you shared today, Mary. And I would love for you to share, where can people get in touch with or learn more about you?
Yeah, thank you. And this is just so fun being on this podcast. So it's fun hanging out with you. And where they can get in touch with me is maryblaylock.com is my website. And then the future career is my Instagram or Facebook. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm having a future career academy workshop, and that's how helps people find direction in their career. And that's you can check out my website and get on the list. And you can also take a quiz on my website for your career personality. It's not going to give you all the answers, but it can just get you started in thinking about some of this stuff. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I will include all of this information in the show notes so that you can find Mary online, take her quiz, find out about her upcoming webinars that are going to be so, so helpful. So thank you again, Mary, for joining today.
It was great hanging out with you.
Awesome. And thank you for listening to today's episode of Courage Permission Slip. If you are finding us on YouTube, make sure that you like this episode and subscribe so that you will be alerted when new episodes are available. And if you are listening to this on your favorite podcast platform, make sure that you please rate and review so that others can find and enjoy this content as well. So that's a wrap for today. Thank you so much for joining, and make sure you tune in to the next episode of Courage Permission Slip. Bye now.